Welcome to Race, Class, and Species, exploring the connections between Black liberation and animal liberation. Just to give all of you a bit of background, the way that I talk about veganism and the way that I talk about animal rights is a little bit different from the way that you might have heard it from the mainstream animal community or the mainstream animal rights community, and that's because I frame veganism within the context of a liberation movement, and specifically from a context of destabilizing what would be called imperialist, white supremacist, cisgender, heteropatriarchal capitalism. And that's a really, really huge phrase. So giggle about it now and don't blame me for it. It is Bell Hooks, so you can absolutely read her writing later. If you 3 cheers for Bell Hooks, but a lot of it is taken from feminist theory, and especially Black feminist theory, and applying it to animal rights and how we can achieve Black liberation along with animal rights instead of looking at it as something that is in competition with another community of marginalized individuals. Since everybody here, or most of the people here, are already vegan, we're not going to get into the most obvious way that we exploit other species or exploit other communities, which is by eating them, because we've all heard that before. But we're going to talk about some of the other ways that that animals have been used and how they are exploited in human communities, and Black people as well, especially from an American perspective, because I am an American Black person, in case you couldn't tell from the accent. But medical experimentation is one of those ways, and it's a very relevant way. This image right here was actually taken from the cover of the book Birthing a Slave. It's actually a great book. And this is a depiction of Dr. J. Marion Sims. J. Marion Sims is broadly known as the father of modern gynecology. And we've got statues of the man, and there are loads of things that are named after him. But what a lot of people don't know is that he actually, he made the medical strides that he did by experimenting primarily on Black women and children. And that's a part of our history that we tend to erase or overlook, or are generally not aware of. And the reason why he experimented on Black people is because it was widely believed that Black people were less vulnerable to pain than our white counterparts. And that's a really scary part of our history. And so, but it is a part of our history, and it's a part of our history that needs to be acknowledged. And so we look at the next slide, and you see beagles, who are also used as experimental animals. And a lot of people are going to ask, well, okay, Sebastian, what you're doing right now is making me feel really uncomfortable because you're comparing Black people and animals. But that's not what we're doing, and I want to make sure that, that we understand why. We're going to look at the next slide. This is a quote from the book Medical Apartheid, and I'll read this to you, especially because it's a little bit fuzzy, and I want to make sure that everyone knows what it says. It says, "The future of the Negro lies more in the research laboratory than in the schools. When diseased, he should be registered and forced to take treatment before he offers his diseased mind and body on the altar of academic and professional education." And then it goes on to say, "It was cheaper to use niggers than cats because they were everywhere and cheap experimental animals." And that's a quote from neurosurgeon Harry Bailey. He reminisced in a 1960s speech he delivered while at Tulane Medical School. See, it's not me making a comparison between Black people and other animals. What I want everyone in this room to understand is that it is actually a product of white supremacy that we've been set up as animals. We're not, we're not considered persons. Everyone probably understands human as a biological classification, but it was actually white supremacy that set up human as a political identity. And everyone who's not human is somehow lesser. And that's, that's something that we need to really, to really internalize as a message, that human isn't just a biological classification, it is a political identity. And it's a very, very specific political identity, because at the time that those experiments were happening in that last slide with Marion Sims, Black people were not considered human. Human is a political identity that largely has meant throughout our history as white. Even in the Declaration of Independence and all of our founding fathers' materials, we understand human to be a very specific class of people. Not even not even just white, but a very specific type of white. You're male, you're cisgender, you're heterosexual, you're upper middle class, you are wealthy. Everybody who does not fit in that category, that includes women of color, anybody of color, everybody that does not have a lot of money, and other species communities were not considered persons. And we've been chasing our personhood ever since. And look, again, it's not me making this comparison, We are considered animals by white supremacy. It was cheaper to use niggers than cats because they were everywhere and cheap experimental animals. We were, and largely today, depending on the context that you're looking at us in, not considered to be persons. And a lot of people are probably going to say, well, Sebastian, that was a really long time ago. That isn't relevant today. So let's just look at the next slide. It says here, however, as late as 1995, radiation scientist Clarence Lushbaugh, MD, explained that he and his partner Eugene Sagner, MD, chose slum patients as radiation subjects because, and again I quote, these persons don't have any money, and they're black, and they're poorly washed. So it's not enough to just be poor and not have any money. Also, being black is a relevant criteria to be used as an experimental animal. This is why it's important for us to understand what animal rights is about, and what animal liberation is about, and what black liberation is about. A lot of people, especially my counterparts in the black community who are not vegan, get really, really frustrated with me because I care about animal rights and because animal rights is important to me. And that's because they believe in a narrative that was passed on to them by white supremacy. They believe that we've been compared to animals, and we need to reclaim this human identity, this political identity that I was speaking of. And it sets up this really false binary, as though we're in competition with other animals, instead of understanding that no, we're not in competition. Black liberation doesn't exist in opposition to animal rights. There are two things that need to be destabilized together. And they are both, again, products of white supremacist society. Another thing that I talk about in my lecture, and that I talk about in the classroom because we teach this at Columbia University as well. Another way that animals are exploited is through zoos. There isn't a lot of focus on zoos because we tend to focus on veganism as a diet, and there are profound conversations that are happening right here at Vevolution about veganism as a diet, and and what it means for us to consume animal bodies. But zoos, I tend to have a conversation about as an extension of the prison industrial complex. Zoos are often regarded as conservation and educational experiences. And I'm here to tell you that zoos are neither. And most of you probably, again, already know that. Reject the narrative that zoos are about conservation, because zoos don't have a lot to do with conservation at all. I have the fortune of being able to work with a lot of people from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management, among other U.S. regulatory agencies. A lot of really smart biologists. And none of them vegan, by the way, which I never understand. But I talk to these people, and all of them generally agree that that the conservation is not the main focus of zoos, even though we really, really push that narrative. Zoos are not places that we go to look at sick animals. They're not about rehabilitation. How often do you go to the zoo and see an animal who is who is a senior? How often do you go to a zoo and see an animal who is infirm? That's not the case. We go to the zoo to see healthy animals. They are here for our entertainment. They're not educational experiences. And that's a handy excuse. Oh, I take my child to the zoo because it's an educational experience. That's bullshit. You can take you don't have to take your children to see someone who is incarcerated to understand their lives. That's what we have National Geographic for. That's why we have YouTube videos. You don't have to take your children to a zoo to have an educational experience. And when you strip away all of these other justifications and all of these other uses, you're left with a fundamental question: what are zoos for? Zoos actually are a leftover product of a culture of imperialism, and we see that here. This is Ota Benga. This image was taken in 1906. Some of you might be familiar with it, but many of you probably not. He actually, this was an image that was taken of him at the Bronx Zoo. You can talk to me about conservation all day long and education, but who exactly were we trying to, let's be realistic, who are we conserving black people from by keeping them confined in zoos? Who are we actually educating by looking at people of color who are being incarcerated against their will? This is a legacy of imperialism. And again, Ota Benga actually killed himself in 1916, 10 years after this picture was taken. And yeah, again, people are probably going to tell me, Sebastian, that was a really long time ago. But This is an image of a girl who was in a human zoo as recently as 1958. In the span of our history, that was last fucking week. So, and if you think that like in the ensuing 50 years that like that we've gotten rid of racism, you know, or that racism went away, that's a really short period of time. Like white supremacy is alive and well, and if you think that it's really comfortable talking about white supremacy in a room full of people that is like, oh, I don't know, 85% white, like I am dying up here on stage, by the way. But like, but yeah, like you know, this is the legacy that we're looking at, and this is why it's so important for me to understand, like you know, to take a racialized view of speciesism, because when we actually look back across our history, like speciesism and racism are two systems that really do inform upon one another in a particularly insidious way. So no, we don't go to zoos. And the next slide is going to be particularly like disturbing for me when I was looking for images. Like this was on the second page of results, and so I just decided to include it in my talk. Applying for a job at prison, why do you want to work at the nigger zoo? That's actually on the second page of Google results when you're starting to look for images of animals in zoos. And what we learn from this image is two things. Number one, zoos are indeed prisons. And this is an acknowledgement of that. And number two, prisons are places where we disproportionately incarcerate Black and brown bodies. So again, our personhood and the personhood of other species is being taken away from them. And this is an example, like this is a testament to that, like, you know, imperialist white supremacist culture that we were talking about. I'm not going to get into the details of the dairy industry. Like, you know, I have a very long conversation about that in the classroom with other people. But I do want to talk about, again, because we're mostly vegan and we don't have a lot of time, we're just not going to talk about like the insidious horrors of dairy for the animals. But like, you know, in relationship to Black liberation, one of the exercises that I do in the classroom is I walk people through what propaganda actually looks like, because a lot of people talk about what I do as vegan propaganda while ignoring or not really interrogating what propaganda looks like in mainstream society. This is a 30-second ad that the Dairy Council actually has. And you can find it on YouTube. I think that this was released in around like October 2010. The Dairy Council, the people that give us the wonderful commercials of folks wearing, like, you know, they're smiling with milk mustaches and everything. And I found this ad to be particularly insidious. You know, I've just got 3 frames from the whole spot, but like it very much encapsulates, like, you know, how white supremacy like influences our food choices as people of color. This is a little girl who is like sitting in a shopping cart looking at what we come to find out is her future self. And, you know, and she's like, okay, well, what's wrong with you? And she's walking up to her and she's looking sad and like, you know, really sluggish. And the girl says, I'm you from the future. And the message immediately, subconsciously, what you take away here is that this is not who you want to be. Because like a lot of people probably, like if you follow American politics or if you follow like American media, like, you know, a Black person wearing a hoodie, that's usually a sign of someone who is definitely underclass. Trayvon Martin, anyone? You might recall, like, you know, he was wearing a hoodie. Like, a hoodie is a signifier of a Black person who is probably even dangerous. Her hair is nappy, as they would say. Overall, first of all, by the way, I want everybody in the room to know that this is exactly what the fuck I look like when I go to the grocery store. So let's don't trip. Let's don't trip. Like, you know what? I'm not getting dressed up in my, like, you know, in my gown and everything to go to the store. That's what I look like. And but that's not what you want to look like. This plays into the politics of respectability. And so she's like, oh wow, like you're me from the future. And so she's like, here, drink this. And she gives her a carton of milk and look at what happens. Holy shit. Everything changed. Everything changed. She's like, you know, first of all, she has good hair. Her body is exposed, and it's amazing. And then she's like, it's working, keep drinking. And so the girl continues to drink the milk, and she proceeds to like run out of the grocery store onto a track and wins the Olympic gold. And so this is the wonderful thing that milk promises you. You don't look like an average person like me that's going to the grocery store. You look like this girl, and like, you know, and you're going to be an Olympian. And so in the last frame, what you see is her mother actually like getting all psyched up because that's the outcome that she wants for her daughter. And, you know, and that's not the reality of, like, you know, of milk. Most of us understand that like dairy is like, you know, it's something that we shouldn't be consuming. Up to 75% of people of color or excuse me, of people of African descent can't digest dairy. We're lactose intolerant. And I think that number goes up to somewhere around 90% of people of Asian descent. So, that's not the outcome. And when we start, actually interrogating these images, we see them in other places in society as well, where we're normalizing not just speciesism, but racism. And we start to call it out, and we see, this is an image of, Colonel Sanders, KFC. You know what? He's selling us, buckets of chickens, dead and dismembered bodies that have been fried. And this is a man that's wearing the costume of a 19th century plantation owner. How the fuck is this a part of, American history? How is he an American cultural icon? And how do we allow that to go on? How is that okay? We're going to wrap up in just a couple of minutes here. One of the last things that I want to talk about is people who work in slaughterhouses. Mainstream veganism usually places vegans in opposition with people who work in slaughterhouses. When I do my activism, I like people to understand that people who work in slaughterhouses usually have a reason to be there. And it's not because they get their jollies from killing animals. It's because that, these people are disproportionately, they're economically depressed and they're disproportionately people of color. And people really want to take me to task on that. Oh, well, they could find another job. That's an extremely privileged and classist thing to say, because the people who run slaughterhouses know that people don't want to do this work. So they specifically set them up in economically depressed parts of the country where people have to work there because they have no choice. There are not a lot of options. And people who work in slaughterhouses disproportionately suffer from a psychological condition called PITS, that is perpetrator-induced traumatic stress, that manifests itself in a number of ways. Depression, substance abuse, alcoholism, domestic violence, and in the worst cases, suicide. It says here the expected arrested and report value of counties with 7,500 slaughterhouse employees are more than double the values where there are no slaughterhouse workers, and that's from Canada's Occupational Health and Safety. You know what, this is a risk to not just the people who work in the slaughterhouses and their families. You know what, you're putting these people into communities. And and increasing the rates of crime, because these are not people who want to work there. We're causing them psychological and emotional trauma. And here, hold on to your hats. This is a really telling thing right here. This is an article that was from, I think, February or March of this year. Slaughterhouse work is so horrible, Canada can't find anyone to do it. And I'll read you the first line from this article. If a job is so incredibly distasteful that no one wants to do it, what do you do? In Canada, sadly, the answer might be to offer those terrible jobs to incoming Syrian refugees. So when I say that there is an intersection between animal violence and racism, this is the racism right here. We can't find any upstanding Canadians who want to do this work. So we're going to force these jobs on literally people who are fucking fleeing a war zone. How is that okay? All because collectively we enjoy having hamburgers and we enjoy saying bacon, and that's not all right. So destabilizing this culture of animal exploitation is very meaningfully to destabilize the means that keep people racially oppressed. And here's a really terrible thing. We have people who walk away after a couple of hours. That's Werner Siegrist of Canada Premium Meats. He was quoted as saying to Global News, even when you don't have any other choices, even when you are faced with the threat of starvation and homelessness, people opt out of doing this work. They can only stand it for a couple of hours and then they leave. That's what we do to people in our mainstream society. So no, people who work in slaughterhouses aren't bad people by and large. People who are part of the military-industrial complex, they're not doing it because they just like shooting other people. No, they have very, very meaningful economic reasons for being there, and that economic oppression is very real. That's why, again, I talk about this in the context of imperialist, white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchal capitalism, because that is the structure that's the entire structure upon which animal exploitation rests. There are other ways that white supremacy influences our relationship with animals, and we again, you start seeing, when you start pulling the threads of this, they start coming out all over the place. And I know I've got to wrap up soon. Just got two more slides, but Okay. One of the ways that that what we generally overlook, how white supremacy influences our relationship with other animals, is in hunting. Now, of course, because we're all vegan, we understand that all animal exploitation is bad. But in mainstream society, people don't interrogate that, and people kind of pick and choose which type of animal exploitation is acceptable. Hunting is largely regarded as an acceptable way of exploiting animals. Some people probably frown upon it, but it's generally accepted. And it's something that generates a lot of money. Poaching, by comparison, is something that is largely carried out by people of color. And everybody thinks that poachers are bad people. And so again, like, this is how white supremacy influences our thinking. Like, hunting is an activity, and I verified the statistics on this again from the US Fish and Wildlife Service. That's an activity that is largely carried out by white people. Over 90% of hunters are white, and I think like 85% of them are male. So this is an activity that's largely carried out by white people that we never really think about. And like, but when it comes to poaching, like, that's, oh, people should not poach. That's wrong. But people who poach aren't doing it for the enjoyment, unlike hunters. People who poach are doing it because they are themselves economically depressed. They're doing it out of survival. And like, and the people who are purchasing the products of poaching are usually people of means. And so that's, that's a problem. We don't internalize, how that happens. There was actually one more slide before this one came up that shows, like, not just poaching and hunting, but like the way that dogs are used. There was an image of a dog attacking a black person in the 1960s during the civil rights movement. Like, when we think about like dogs fighting other dogs, that's wrong. We think about like how we shake a finger at Michael Vick and say he's a horrible person because he's trained dogs to fight other dogs for his enjoyment. But we don't interrogate how white supremacy actually does that and carries that out in society. When we train dogs to fight humans who are themselves oppressed, then that's okay. We, in fact, give those dogs medals. As a matter of fact, we thank them for their service, but it's always in the service of someone who has the greater good, someone who actually has, like, more social, economic, and cultural capital. And like, and that is a wrong. Unless we learn how to destabilize that, that's going to be like our efforts as animal liberationists and black liberationists are definitely going to end up being frustrated. And this is the last slide. Like, this is something I always end with because it's something that's so meaningful for me. Solidarity is not a matter of altruism. Solidarity comes from the inability to tolerate the affront to our own integrity of passive or active collaboration in the oppression of others. And from the deep recognition that, like it or not, our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on the planet. Thank you all.